Hello my friends, welcome back to my channel. So today I have some recommendations for you, and they are all fantasy romance books. Now, all of these are, I think all of them are adult fantasy romance books, and well, one I have seen it marketed as a YA, but I feel like it sort of reads more, it could go either way on that one. I have one that may be YA. But these are all some fantasy romance books that I have read recently that I have really enjoyed that I wanted to share with you. I have really enjoyed all of these to different levels. I feel like sometimes it can be hard to find really great fantasy romance that hits you with an equal amount of fantasy and romance. So some of these have varying levels of that, so I'll be sure to let you know if I feel like it's more heavy on the fantasy side or more heavy on the romance side. And I feel like there are a few that I feel like have a really great blend of both in them, so just wanted to let you know that I have some that are going to lean more towards one or the other, but they all have romance in them as a big part of the plot. So we're going to start out with one of my most recent favorites, and that is A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. I just barely read this. I buddy read this with my friend Avery from Avery Loves Books. We both so much enjoyed this, and it has become honestly one of my favorite fantasy romances that I have ever read. This is a Hades and Persephone retelling, and I feel like it is one of the better ones that I have ever read. It is a direct Hades and Persephone retelling in that we have both Hades by name and Persephone by name. But it does have a little bit of a twist in that it's set in sort of like a modern day world where gods and goddesses walk around the world and people know that they exist, and it's just a part of society. So it has a little bit of an urban fantasy vibe in there too. The city that they live in is called New Athens, and that's where we find Persephone, who is a news reporter or a journalist. I believe she's just a journalist. She's a reporter of some type, and she found out that Hades has a very, very popular gambling den. And so she goes there one night, and Hades is very well known for nobody can win with any bet that they make with Hades. So she goes there one night. She ends up ensnared with Hades, mostly just because she's so completely drawn and attracted to him. They have this little moment, and they make a deal, a bet. And so Persephone ends up going to the underworld with Hades to try and win this bet. The bet is that Hades bets that she cannot make life in the underworld. Persephone is the goddess of spring, and she has been struggling with her magic and trying to make life. So he takes her to the underworld and bets that she will not be able to do that, and if she doesn't, then, you know, Hades and Persephone retelling. So the things that I really liked about this is that it was very readable, it was really very sexy, it was very steamy, it was super, super fun and fast-paced and enjoyable. I loved Hades. I felt like he was an excellent representation of Hades. He was very much a full figure in this too. He wasn't necessarily a background character, like he was front and center. He was very, like, he's sort of like my typical favorite Hades in that he's very dark and he's very broody, but he has some real serious feelings for Persephone. This was such a wonderful book. I loved it so much, and I can't wait to keep reading in the series. The next book that I have to recommend is probably one of the very best fantasies that I have read in a very long time, one of the very, very best fantasy romances. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was very beautiful and very well done, and that is The Heart of the Fae by Emma Hamm. This book was just so wonderful. This was so well done. I super enjoyed this one. This was a very slow burn romance, very, very, very slow burn, but there is a romance element to it, also very much. It's like a huge part of the plot, but it takes a while to get there. Just putting that out there, because I know some of you don't like that. But if you really love a unique Beauty and the Beast retelling, which is what this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling mixed with Irish mythology. Both of those I am completely gone for. I love Irish mythology. I feel like we don't have a lot of it in fantasy, and especially in fantasy romance, and I love Beauty and the Beast retellings, and I felt like this was just a perfect blend of the two of those. So this book follows Sorka, who is a midwife and a healer in her town where she lives with her people. Her father has recently become infected with a plague that has really decimated her people, and there's no cure for it. So Sorka ends up finding or meeting with this Fae Lord who says that if she goes to sort of rescue this forgotten king, or to find this forgotten king in this other land who's on a crumbling throne, that she will find the answer to how to heal her father and her family and her people from this plague. So she ends up traveling there to try and find him, and he is a very unique take on Beauty and the Beast in that he when he was a child, his brother, he had a twin brother, like plunged a sword in him, and instead of bleeding and all the stuff that would happen when you would hit someone with a sword, like there were crystals that erupted through his skin, sort of like a geode, which I thought was really cool and really unique. And so every time that he gets injured, that sort of happens, so his whole body is kind of transforming into that. This romance was super slow burn, but it was also so satisfying when it got to the end. I loved Sorka. She was such a strong heroine. She was just a perfect match for the hero. She calls him Stone, but that's not his real name. But because they're Fae, you know, they're kind of careful with their real names, so she doesn't find his real name out until further on into the book. But their romance was very sweet, but it was also like they were very guarded, but Stone was so enamored with her and was just couldn't believe that she would ever actually love him. This book also does end with a cliffhanger, so it is have romance in it, and it is heavily romance based. There are some steamy scenes on the page, but it doesn't get a resolution in the first book, so you need to keep reading to find out exactly what happens so they get their happily ever after. But the thing that I also loved about this was it just felt like the fantasy world was so richly developed and it was so beautiful. I loved all the mythological creatures from Irish mythology. Like we have a puka, we have selkies, we have all of those things that I just really love. I felt like this was super unique. It was beautifully done. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend it. Just go in knowing you don't get an HEA at the end of this book, and the romance is slow burn. But if you are a huge fan of Irish mythology, Beauty and the Beast retellings, and you love a really rich, beautiful fantasy world, I would highly recommend this because it was so, so good. I just loved it. And the next book that I have to recommend is actually a novella, so this is a little short one. This is Snowspelled by Stephanie Burgess, I'm not sure how you say her name. This was a really delightful and a fun, unique fantasy romance, and it was super short, so you could read it pretty quickly. This is basically a Regency historical romance with magic in it, and I just really, really love that. But it's also not exactly a Regency romance because it's in England instead of England, and there are some different things with like the social structure that make it not quite a historical romance, but it definitely has that vibe there. So this book follows Cassandra, who comes from this line of magicians, but in this world, women could not have magic. Women were more on the political side of England at that time, whereas the men were the magicians and they had all the magic and the powers. But Cassandra really has always felt this stirring in her for magic, and so she believes that she could be a great magician if she just had the chance. And so she starts to develop that magic, but then something happens to her where her magic is taken away, and it almost creates such a big scandal that she ends up breaking her engagement with her fiancé and sort of ends up retreating because it was such a big scandal what happened with her. They don't go into great detail about what the scandal was, but it's still there the whole time throughout this story. So she ends up snowbound in this house in the woods with some family and some friends and people who aren't friends. This society goes there to this party, but it's really deep in the elven woods. And so there's this, they end up traveling, there's like trolls in this world too, but it also has that just that beautiful historical romance Regency England backdrop, which is really beautiful and really fun. And Cassandra ends up meeting this elven lord who tasks her with finding a rogue magician, basically, who is using his powers in an evil way to create this massive snowstorm. And I really loved this a lot. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I felt like this was just a really fun, unique fantasy romance. I loved the historical romance type of setting. I loved the weather magic. I really liked the political setup for how the women were the politicians and the men were the magicians. I thought it was really unique and really beautiful and well done, and I would highly recommend it. I definitely want to keep reading on in this series. And the next book that I have to recommend is also a novella, and that is the Midwinter Mail Order Bride by Katie Wilde. I absolutely love this one. I gave this one 5 stars. I think this is a super fun, super unique, very fast-paced, filled with a lot of banter and funny moments. It was very steamy, and that it was just honestly one of my favorite reads of last year. I super enjoyed it. This book follows Princess Anya, who offers herself as a bride to Kale the Barbarian. Kale is the recent conqueror of this kingdom, and it's Anya's desire to go in there, marry him, kill him, and then take his kingdom for her own. But as often happens, they end up really having this big attraction to one another. They end up traveling back to her kingdom because he's going to try and help her family that is there. They have something that she knows is happening because she has magic but nobody else does, and along the way on their little road trip type of journey, they end up having some major feelings for one another and falling in love with each other. I love this one so much. It was so fast-paced. It was so fun. It was a read-in-one sitting type of book. Kale was such a fabulous hero, and he was such a stern alpha, but was so soft for her. So he was basically a perfect alpha mellow hero. It was just wonderful. I highly recommend this one. The next book that I have to recommend is The Deal with the Elf King by Elise Kova. This book was such a delight to read, honestly. I really enjoyed this. I love this so much. So this book follows Luella, who is a human healer, and she's always had this really big affinity with like the earth and healing, and it almost borders on something magical. And in Luella's kingdom, which borders on the elven world, there is sort of this deal where an elf king will come every so many years to take a human bride and bring her back to his kingdom in the hopes that it will heal or replenish and rejuvenate the magic in his kingdom. But they have not had any human queen in recent years that has had any magic. So Eldis the Elf King comes to the human world determined to get a human queen and bring her back to his kingdom. He ends up seeing Luella, and he immediately knows that she is the one who has the magic, even though she has sort of been cloaked by people who love and care for her. So he takes her back to his kingdom, and they sort of settle into this marriage that is really a marriage of convenience. There's a little bit of animosity between the two of them. Luella is pretty angry that she's been taken away from her home where she feels like she was doing a great work being a healer. And Eldis is a little bit miffed that she wasn't there to help his kingdom earlier. It really ends up this really fascinating study of the two of them sort of going from animosity to an allyship to then really loving one another, and I felt like it was just really beautiful and really sweet. I feel like the fantasy world in this was really beautifully developed. I loved the elf world. I loved the magic that they had. I really loved the side characters in this. I really enjoyed this. This had a very quiet, soft, subtle fantasy world that I think is just a perfect blend for the love story in this couple. This book is the one that I was talking about that says I believe this is marketed as YA. I thought it was an adult romance, but I think it is YA. It's very much a PG-13, very much a slow burn, but it was still really, really beautiful, and I just really loved it. The next book that I have to recommend is The Winter King by C.L. Wilson. I recently read this in January, which was a perfect time to read it because it has really great winter vibes, and I really enjoyed this book. This book follows Winter and Kamsin. So Winter has a really good reason for having a grudge or wanting to have a war with the Summerlee King. But he does decide that he's going to try and take his vengeance and also broker a peace between the two of them by taking one of the Summerlee King's daughters to be his bride. And then he's thinking that he will get an heir with her and then just discard her, and that will get back at the king. He ends up taking the youngest daughter of the Summerlee King, whose name is Kamsin. She has some very powerful storm magic that almost rivals Winter's. Winter is super powerful too. And he ends up taking her. They both have this really fierce attraction to one another, but also a lot of dislike at the beginning, and over the course of the book it really is beautiful to watch them sort of very slowly grow from hating each other and doing their duty through this marriage of convenience, and Winter still holding a grudge against the Summerlee's kingdom, and then he really starts to see Kamsin for how powerful and strong she is, and also how big her heart is, and I just really loved this. I thought this was super enjoyable. It is definitely a long book, but I really liked it. I felt like it had a little bit of like a medieval vibe, like that's sort of like the fantasy world in this isn't really vast, it's not really sweeping, it's sort of a quiet medieval fantasy with some weather magic and some other aspects to it, but I felt like it was super enjoyable and I really, really liked this one. And the last book that I have to recommend, I saved this for last because I figured most people would hear about this because it is super popular, especially right now on BookTube, and I personally have talked about it quite a lot, and that is A Heart of Blood and Ashes by Milivane. This book is probably my favorite book on this list for a fantasy romance. The fantasy world in here is rich and dark, and it's so well built and well developed, and every aspect of this fantasy world feels realistic and like it's rooted in this ancient mythology. And the romance in this is so powerful, and it is like right there from the get-go, even though it is an enemies to lovers romance for sure. It's just this ever-present element throughout the entire book, and I feel like that makes this probably the most successful fantasy romance that I have ever read, because everything in this book revolves around both the fantasy and the political world, but also the romance between these two characters. And these characters in here are so freaking interesting because you have this harsh, stern Maddox, who is the hero, who is set on finding vengeance for the person who killed his mother and father, which he comes to find out is Yvain, who is the heroine, who he actually ends up hunting down and seeking to get vengeance because of what she has done to his parents. But when he meets her, he's really sort of taken aback by her plan, which is, let's marry, let's have a child, and then let's overthrow my father, who actually is responsible for your parents' death. Yvain is very weak and very small. She's not physically imposing at all. She's not a warrior, but her mind and her wit and her remarks that she makes to him are so strong and fierce and powerful, and she is just this iron force of a woman in this frail, weak body, and I just absolutely loved watching this story unfold between these two, who were really star-crossed lovers, enemies, and watching them totally and completely fall for each other, especially Maddox. Like, I feel like Maddox really, in parts of this book, was not very nice to Yvain, and he was really very unlikable at times, but there's also something about him that makes you understand that a little bit. Not that you understand how he treated her, but you can definitely understand his anger and how he feels so hurt and betrayed by what he believes that she has done. And watching him really grow to appreciate and love Yvain for who she was and what she did was just a beautiful thing to behold. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I feel like this is the standard against which all fantasy romance books should be held to because it was just completely perfect in every way. This book was a little bit hard for me to get into. I really wasn't invested in this until I had gotten past the first 150 pages. So if you want to pick this up, just be aware that it may be a little bit of a slow get into in the beginning because it's not, there is zero info dumping in here, but it is fantasy world building heavy. And I feel like if you're not prepared for that, it may be a little bit off-putting at first, but if you are ready for that, if you really want a deep, rich, dark fantasy world with some really amazing romance, then I can't recommend this book enough. I thought it was just absolutely fantastic. One of my favorite reads of all time. The ultimate fantasy romance right here. All right. Those are my recommendations for fantasy romance books. I hope that you all enjoyed this video. If you know of a great fantasy romance book that I didn't mention, please feel free to let me know what that is. Also, I wanted to mention this is the second fantasy romance recommendation video that I have. I will have the link for the first video that I made down below. So I do have some other fantasy romance books that I love, but I probably already talked about them in that first video. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you in my next video.